The last person executed in Alberta was a mass murderer named Robert Raymond Cook. In 1959, Cook brutally killed his father, stepmother, and his 5 young half-siblings who were all under the age of 10. He was first convicted in November of that year, and his conviction was upheld after a second trial on June 20th, 1960. Despite his pleas for clemency to Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, Cook was hanged on November 15th, 1960.
I initially set out to make a video about Cook, his crime, and his execution, but as I was pulling research materials together, I realized that his story was already fairly well documented in the form of books and articles and mainstream media features. But as I was going through some of those old newspaper articles, a down-page story in the June 29th, 1959 edition of the Calgary Herald caught my attention.
Just 3 years ago, the people of Stettler district were shocked by another tragedy, the fatal shooting of 7 persons at Erskine, just 7 miles east of here. Within 24 hours, the death toll had risen to 8 when the body of Jack Clark, 41-year-old MLA, was found in 3 feet of water, half a mile from his farm home.
This was surprising to read, as I had never heard the story of the sitting member of the Legislative Assembly of Alberta murdering 7 people, so I decided to make a video about that instead. Who was John E. Clark? How did he become one of the worst mass murderers in Alberta history, and why have so few people ever heard of him?
Born March 29, 1915 in Stettler, John Eder Clark, who sometimes went by Jack, by most accounts had a typical upbringing in the vast fields of rural Alberta. After finishing his studies in Stettler, he moved to Calgary to continue his education at the Calgary Normal School, where he was awarded a first-class teacher certificate as part of the class of 1934. According to the class yearbook, Clark was the first-term president of Class 1B. His yearbook biography reads, in part, "Came to CNS with expectations of becoming a teacher, but isn't too sure of it now." His photo and bio are his only mentions in the yearbook, as it didn't seem he took part in any social or sporting clubs. After a year at CNS, he taught in Calgary for a few years, but his rural roots called him back to farming. He taught part-time in the communities surrounding Erskine, Alberta, near which he eventually acquired 1,000 acres of land and a 2-story farmhouse. In 1947, he married Margaret Dinwoodie of Vancouver, and the pair went on to have 4 children, Janina, Ross, Anne, and Linda. In the Alberta election of 1952, the Social Credit Party under Premier Ernest Manning won its 5th consecutive government and its 3rd with Manning as leader. Among a fresh crop of MLAs was John E. Clark, the new member for Stettler.
As a rookie MLA, Clark didn't make too many waves in his first term. There's very little mention of him in the newspapers, and he was never selected for a cabinet position.
Clark was widely regarded as an affable man who often traded jokes and barbs in the Alberta legislature with both his so-called colleagues and members of the Liberal opposition. Fiercely loyal to Premier Manning, he would vehemently defend any criticism of the government's personnel and policies. He was nominated a second time for the general election of June 29, 1955. Despite a comparative shellacking for the Social Credit Party, where their majority was reduced by 16 seats, Clark carried his riding once again, but this time with only a 56% share of the vote. During his first term and into the beginning of his second, Clark performed the perfunctory duties of a backbencher, attending hospital openings in his riding, laying wreaths at local remembrance ceremonies, giving speeches to social clubs, and participating in his party's constituency meetings.
For about a year after Election Day in 1955, the newspapers again had very few mentions of the MLA from Stettler, but all that would change on June 4th, 1956, when John E. Clark's name was on the front page of newspapers across Alberta and Canada.
That morning, a neighbor and tenant of the Clark family, G.M. Parrott, discovered the body of farmhand George Anderson, aged 20, of McLennan, Alberta, in the front room of the farmhouse. Upon entering the house further, he found the body of a Royal Canadian Navy sailor, Bill Ola, a visiting friend of the Clark family. And in another room, the bodies of Margaret Clark and the 4 Clark children, Janina, age 8, Ross, age 7, Anne, age 5, and Linda, age 4. After seeing all that, Parrott told the Herald, "I just got out of there as fast as I could." He said he had not seen John at all that morning. George Anderson had worked on the Clark family farm for 3 years, and his parents were proud their son was working for an MLA. When Parrott came upon Bill Ola, the stricken sailor was still alive. The 20-year-old was on leave and visiting the Clark farm from his home port in Vancouver. He'd met the Clark family years earlier while a high school student. John, being a teacher, had tutored and counseled Bill during his teenage years, and Bill regularly spent his holidays at the farm. Ola died later in hospital in Stettler, without ever being able to make a statement on what had happened. The Albertan described John E. Clark as a former mental patient. The paper reported that Clark was under the care of a psychiatrist at the Calgary General Hospital 2 years prior in 1954. Clark had voluntarily entered care after a nervous breakdown, according to the Albertan. The incident in which Clark reportedly verbally attacked opposition members and then broke down weeping was never reported by the press because, according to the Albertan, a cabinet member asked journalists to exercise discretion. Parrott said he was shaken when he made the gruesome discoveries. "I went in and found them," Parrott said. "That's all there was to it. It wasn't nice." Parrott called Dr. Robert Zender, a local physician and the district coroner, and Zender contacted the RCMP. Within hours, Mounties from Camrose, Red Deer, Wetaskiwin, Bashaw, and other close-by detachments were dispatched to the slain family's homestead, and they fanned out through the surrounding hills and fields searching for Clark, who was, so far, unaccounted for. In the initial stages of the investigation, Clark wasn't publicly considered a suspect. The lead investigator, RCMP Inspector M.T. LeBerge, told the Calgary Herald, "Our search is only for a missing man," when asked if he thought Clark was the perpetrator. Dr. Zender told the Albertan that all the victims had been shot once in the head at close range, except Anderson, who had been shot twice. Into the evening, neighbors on the surrounding farms were cautioned by RCMP to stay inside and not answer their doors. Some fled and spent the night in Stettler, but those warnings would ultimately be unnecessary, as late Monday night the body of John Clark was spotted from a Royal Canadian Air Force Otter aircraft that was assisting the search. His body was laying face down in a slough 30 feet from the muddy edge, making it invisible to ground searchers. The slough was a mere 500 meters from the Clark family home. Beside Clark's body, RCMP Constable R.D. Novikos found a single-shot .22 caliber rifle, the same kind used on Clark's family and boarders. Dr. Zender, also on the scene, identified a single bullet hole in Clark's forehead. The RCMP released more details of the killing after the discovery of John Clark's body. It's believed the killings took place between 9 and 10 a.m., and the bodies were discovered by Mr. Parrott at 10:30. There were several pools of blood around the outside of the house, indicating Clark killed at least 2 of the children outside before moving their bodies indoors. During the search, crews had gotten as close to Clark's body as 200 feet, but windy conditions obstructed any scent that might have alerted the search dogs. In the days prior to the murders, Clark and his wife had been in Saskatchewan helping that province's Social Credit Party plan for their upcoming election. On their return, the Clarks discovered some of their farm machinery had broken down, and the milk produced by their dairy cattle had been rejected for sale by the local cooperative. One neighbor ominously told the Calgary Herald that the day before the murders, Clark told him he wanted to go into the lake and keep swimming. After the discovery of Clark's body, the community breathed a sigh of relief now knowing an armed madman wasn't roaming their fields. On hearing the news that Clark was dead, John Proctor, a cousin and neighbor to the Clarks, exclaimed to gathered newspaper and radio reporters, "Thank God." Another neighbor, Mrs. T.G. Anderson, who said she'd known Clark since he was a boy, told the Herald before news came of Clark's demise, "I hope he isn't alive." Margaret Clark's father, George W. Dinwoodie of Vancouver, said he was shocked by the murders, telling reporters he knew of no financial or other motives Clark might have had to push him towards such a terrible act. Dinwoodie was preparing for a visit to the family, a trip he made regularly, when he got word that his daughter and grandchildren had been murdered. By Wednesday, Alberta's chief coroner, Dr. M.M. Cantor, announced he was satisfied that the crime was indeed a murder-suicide and said no further inquest or investigation would proceed. Funerals for the Clark family, including John, would be held on Friday, June 8th, 4 days after the discovery of their bodies. The Calgary Herald summed up the case succinctly, saying the following in their Wednesday, June 6th edition. 6 coffins will be buried side by side Friday afternoon near Stettler following one of the largest and most tragic mass killings in Alberta history, and there, authorities believe, will end the weird case of Social Credit MLA Jack Clark, who is thought to have killed 5 members of his family, 2 young men, and then himself.
Weird indeed. And close to 500 people attended the funeral, which was given a front-page story in the Herald the next day. And in what I can only describe as a lurid article by Herald reporter Bruce Phillips, the focus was on Clark himself and not at all on the family that he had annihilated. Not until the 3rd paragraph does it identify Clark as the killer. It also quotes the presiding minister, A. Everett Morrison, saying, "We must keep in mind what a respected man was Jack Clark and that he had a sincere interest in his fellow human beings." It was clearly a different time back then, but better editorial decisions should have been made.
The Clark family is buried at Liberal Cemetery near the town of Erskine, all 6 memorialized by a single headstone with the epitaph, "Safe in the arms of Jesus."
The Clark family story is so tragic and awful that people just wouldn't want to discuss it. Even though it happened decades ago and it's a part of Alberta history, the singularly heinous nature of this kind of crime keeps it from being front of mind. It's not like the Robert Raymond Cook case that can be examined through the lens of social progress and the evolution of the Canadian justice system. It's just sad and senseless. As with so many of these kinds of cases, there's no way of knowing what the motive was for the murder of the Clark family by John Clark, or what might have driven a man with a seemingly idyllic life to such an extreme. For this case, and so many others like it, there will, sadly, never be a satisfactory explanation. Thank you so much for watching. There's more of my Alberta-related content on screen right now. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.